Okay, but I figured that before we actually get to the topic, because we had to vote on it also, there's ants attacking here. Okay. Anyways, this is a fun shir I give every so often, but I think it's a good shir to give before we start researching, because it highlights to me what is one of the thorniest issues in Psak, and that is that text is by definition ambiguous. And this creates a real problem when you're trying to paskin and make decisions, because even if you have authoritative texts, if you think the texts are ambiguous, so figuring out what those texts mean is hard. And I don't just mean you have a complicated text and it might go one way, it might go the other way. You could it has nuance. I mean that sometimes text in the hand of the right interpreter can easily be made to say opposite things. Nechama Leibovich is said to have once quipped, right, that in the hands of the wrong person, right, the Aseret HaDibrot could be read very differently, because all you have to do is read them rhetorically. Lo tirtzach, right, you shouldn't murder. Right? Right? I mean, there's literally nothing. If you want to, you could read any text however. And the reason I think that's important, first of all, it reminds us how much flexibility you have in text. The second is to remind us that to pretend that the halachic texts constrain us automatically is dangerous. Right? Meaning we are constrained by the texts. But to think that because we all speak about similar canonical texts, that there's a limit to what can be said, is to forget that that's not necessarily the case, because the range of what can be said on any given text is so wide. And that reinforces, for me at least, one of the key factors in Psak, which is integrity. Right? If the text can't constrain you, then you have to trust the people who are reading those texts and interpreting those texts to be doing that with integrity. And what I put here is some extreme examples, just because I think before we start analyzing texts with an eye towards making decisions, I want to remind you how difficult it is to conclusively prove anything from any text at all. To start with, here's a Gemara which Rabbeinu Tam really hated and basically denied that it said what it said. But this is a Gemara in Sanhedrin that reminds you of what I just said in perhaps, at least read simply, the starkest of ways. So who wants to take the first source? There's two lines here in Gemara in Sanhedrin, Daf Yud Zayin. Go ahead.
Amar Yehuda Amar Rav, Ein Moshi'in B'Sanhedrin, Ela Mi She'Yodea
L'Taher. Okay, so what does that mean? Right, Moshivin meaning just from Yoshev. We can't appoint, right? We can't have someone sit on the Sanhedrin.
Appoint someone to the Sanhedrin, who knows.
Unless he knows. So L'Taher is to declare pure.
Unless he knows how to declare pure from impure.
So it's unless he knows, unless we don't put someone in the Sanhedrin unless he's capable of explaining why a sheretz, which is a impure, not kosher, creepy crawler, is in fact kosher, is in fact tahor. Now, what's the obvious problem that Rabbeinu Tam asks? I didn't even give you Rabbeinu Tam, but it's an obvious question.
Sheretz cannot be tahor.
Yes, correct. It's just wrong. Right? It's just wrong. And then the Gemara goes on, and Amar Rav says, Ani adon b'tarenu. Here's my argument. If a snake kills, and therefore increases tumah in the world, and yet it is tahor, sheretz she'eno mimit, a sheretz which does not kill, umaribet tumah, and therefore does not increase the prevalence of tumah in the world, eno din she'he tahor, isn't it pure? And the Gemara answers, Veloi, it's not true, obviously. Midav ekutz balma. A snake is just like a thorn, right? Meaning it's not, the fact that it makes things tameh, it's not because it's a super tameh, it just happens to be able to kill, right? You wouldn't say the same thing about a thorn, right? It's just, it happens to be able to kill, and therefore, the fact that it can kill and therefore create tumah has nothing to do with its own tumah and tara status. Now, Rabbeinu Tam really hates this Gemara, or denies its simple read, because he says, well, I don't understand. What is the value of pilpulim shel heaven? Right? What is the value of someone being able to really cleverly explain why something which is not tameh, something which is tameh is in fact not tameh? It's just wrong. Like, it's very nice that you can adduce logical arguments for why that should be the case, but it's not the case. So Rabbeinu Tam says, what's the value? And he reinterprets the Gemara. But what's the simple read of this Gemara? Why would you say that someone who wants to be on the Sanhedrin has to be capable of explaining why what is kosher is not kosher, or what's tameh is tahor? Yeah.
I mean, maybe just the idea of being like, you're capable of doing this, and like you're capable of logical reasoning, but like you still understand that the base rule is that it's just not the case. So like,
right, meaning
it's go with that, even if you have like a logical argument.
Yeah, so it seems to be that there's this balance. We want someone who understands that there is no. We want someone smart enough to understand that logically there is no constraint to what you could say if you're smart enough. But to recognize at the same time that not everything that could be true is true. And to be constrained. Right? But you see that the way the Gemara phrases it is that they have to be capable of explaining to you why something which is wrong is in fact right. Now this is very dangerous, right? There's a cynical joke that goes around universities that consistently the most immoral base professors on any faculty are
The law professors?
the professors of what? Of ethics. Why? Because they can literally justify anything, right? You spend all day explaining both sides of every ethical issue, so you can always explain why something is moral, right? Or immoral. You know, if you want to be an extreme Ayn Rand-esque philosopher, so you write a book called The Virtue of Selfishness, right? And you basically say that straight up selfish hedonism is a virtue, right? You can come up with whatever you want. But if you don't just admit that, right? So what the Gemara is getting at is, first of all, in order for someone to be on the Sanhedrin, first of all, they need to understand. They need to be smart enough to be able to see that every legal argument can go in multiple directions. But they need to do that because if they don't recognize that just because something could be argued as true doesn't make it true, and there are constraints, but those constraints are internal from your own integrity and not from the text necessarily, then they're not going to be good. Right? They're not going to be wary enough. They're not going to be careful enough on the Sanhedrin. But the Gemara is telling you how malleable texts are if we expect a posek to have the mental capabilities of explaining why yes is no and no is yes, right is wrong and wrong is right. So what I just put on this sheet are just really a collection of some of my favorite examples. They're from a variety of places in Shas, but I just think they're good examples which highlight this point and just sort of show how flexible text can be so that you're on guard or you're ready for the possibility that just because two of you are looking at the same text doesn't mean you're going to come to the same conclusion at all. So, because it's today's Daf Yomi, which wasn't really planned, but as I was going through the Daf, I remembered that this was in fact today's Daf. Why don't we start with one from today's Daf? Okay, turn the page to number 12. I don't know if any of you do the Daf. I know you started. Okay, good. So for the people who are doing the Daf,
Haven't done it yet today.
Okay, good. So we'll think about the Daf for a minute. This is a wonderful little anecdote. Okay, So, why don't you take it? Take it in advance. Number 12.
No. No, thank you.
Okay.
No.
Okay, fine. I'll tell you the following. It's a story. Rabbi Yossi Haglili Havekazil Barucha. Rabbi Yossi was walking on the way. And Ashkechei Leburia. So while he was walking, he met Buria, right? The famed, brilliant...
Oh, is this the one where she says, like, you shouldn't be talking to me?
Very good. Yeah, it's a great story. Two-liner. Right, the famed sage, Buria, the wife of Rabbi Meir. Amar La. So he said to her, Be'eza derech nelech lalud. Which way should we go to Lud? Right, he asked for directions. Amrale. So she said to him, Glili Shota, you idiot Galilean. Lo kach amru chachamim al tara basicha ma'isha. Didn't the sages say that you shouldn't talk too much to women? Haya l'chalomar be'eza l'lud. You should have said, Lud where? Right? Or something. Right? I guess that captures the English translation of that. Right? Be'eza l'lud. Okay, good. Very good. Two-liner. What conclusion do you learn from this Gemara?
Don't make unnecessary conversation with women.
Good. So one possibility is to take this Gemara very literally. And that is the position that the Magen Avot of the Rashbetz takes in number 13. Commenting on the Mishnah that Buria is commenting on, right? Al tarbe sicha emai isha. He says, Al tarbe sicha lazir shelo yavo hanichnasin beveito lidbatel midivrei Torah. Don't speak too much to women, because it warns you that it'll lead to bittul Torah. Shazu mitra baba aveira he shim yarbe aniyem betoch beito. Right, so this is even with anybody. And then in the next paragraph he says, Be'ishto, right? This is even with your wife. Amru v'shnayim p'numot matzad v'ishto nida. B'ishto Torah b'bnei shizvatum b'dvei Torah, right? Even if she's not a nida because of bittul Torah. And the next paragraph he says, Kal v'chomer b'eish v'chaveiro. For sure you shouldn't speak to someone else's wife. And then if you go to the third line, he says, "Ulefi perushenu yoter pashut kal vachomer shemishto tehora asur larbot sicha." If we say you shouldn't talk too much to your own wife, even when she's tehora, kol shkemesh chavero, for sure someone else's wife, but lo ribui mamash asur. And then he says, ribui doesn't mean a lot. Doesn't mean don't be garrulous. Ella afilu teva yetera asur. Even a single extra word is forbidden. What's his proof? Kemasher got to Buria, like Buria said. Right? Al tarpa sicha ma'isha. Right? She said, Be'eda derech nelech lalud, and responded, Be'eza lalud. So, you tell me, is the Magen Avot a possible read of the text? Yeah. What type of read is it?
It's very literal.
Yes, it's a hyper-literal text, a read of the text. Very good. Right? So, you can easily see how someone would read this text and come to that conclusion by reading literally. Right? So I want you to understand that right now, if we're going to offer any other interpretation, what are we doing?
Contradicting this guy.
First, we're contradicting the Tashbates, but methodologically, right? What is our assumption about this text if we disagree with the Tashbates?
That it's not meant to be read literally.
Yeah, right? This isn't just a question of interpretation. This is from one extreme to the other. Is it literal or not literal? That's it.
I mean, even if it's literal, you can just read it in the context of like all the other stories going on here.
Well, there are a bunch of other stories there, and Buria is very sharp in general, yes.
She's just like a sarcastic, witty person, like in the
Good, but what's the meaning of her statement?
Maybe she's like critiquing society.
Oh, good. So what's she doing?
She's saying like you have ridiculous expectations about how you talk to women and like.
Good. So right. Benny Lau basically says a version of what Brooke said here, which is she's right. This isn't really her saying you shouldn't say an extra word, right? I mean, he has a particular spin on it, which maybe you agree with, maybe you don't. But his read of it goes something like this: Buria is this great sage. She wants to be treated as such. But here, she finally, right, she's about to, one of the leading sages of the generation, Rabbi Yossi Aglili, comes and approaches her, and she's like, oh, look, Rabbi Yossi Aglili is going to come. He's going to engage me in conversation about substance, like, he would any other sage. And what does Rabbi Yossi Aglili do?
He just asks for directions.
He just asks for directions. So Ray Lau says, oh, she's frustrated. Because what does she say?
Now she's
Look, if you're going to treat me like the person that I am, the sage that I am, great. But if you're not, you're going to ignore me, right? You're just going to ignore the fact that I'm a sage and ignore the opportunity to speak to me in Torah like you would if you happen to run into a male sage. So then, limit your speech as much as possible. I have no interest in basically being treated as just someone to provide directions, right? If you want to talk to me, and if not, don't.
Yeah,
Right?
also, if you pick up the Bitul Torah aspect of this part, it could make what she's saying.
Sure, right? You could definitely add the Bitul Torah.
Like if you're not going to talk to me about Torah, then just
right. You could definitely say that. My preferred read on this Gemara is slightly different than that, though I'm not married to it, but is my preferred read on it, and that is, it's not how many words that he says. There is in fact one word that he says that is extremely inappropriate, which she picks up on, which is what I think.
What, Nelech?
Yeah, why Nelech?
Because it's do we go?
Yeah, they're very good. Right? He didn't actually ask for directions. He said, in which way do we go to Lud? Now that's actually a very inappropriate question. Right? She's not going to Lud, and why is he inviting, right, somebody else's wife, right? Asking directions by inviting somebody else's wife to take a long stroll to another city with him, right? And what her statement may be is more, Chazal say, limit discussions with women because it might lead to something inappropriate. Inviting someone else's wife, with no background, candidly, on a long trip to another city is in fact inappropriate, which might lead to her, outburst. One way or the other, I think that there's good reason to believe that the Taj Beitz's uber literal read of this Gemara is not pshat. But it's a good example because it shows you that the halachic implications of this agadic statement come down to not how do you interpret it, but very simply, are you willing to read this literally? Are you willing, right? Do you feel compelled to read it literally? Even in agadic text, which in general, right, he makes two big leaps. One is that it's literal, and two that the agadic text is halachic, right? There are so many reasons you could not make that radical read. One, you could say it's agadic, so lighten which weight you give it, and then there's all these, other literary or sociological reads that we're offering, whatever you want to say, we're offering. But it comes out from, again, not just a question of how exactly to interpret it. Is this literal or completely not literal? And that's a big difference, right? That's a big difference.
I feel like both interpretations are literal. It's just like, are you taking a literary analysis approach, or are you taking a deriving
fine.
approach?
They're not. Okay, we can quibble about the word literal.
I just think like the way he's reading is like he's seeing this agadic story and he's deriving pshat from it, versus like seeing this agadic story as an agadic story. Both of those sound very literal to me.
Okay, meaning one of them is not deriving any halachic implications, or
not any.
Not any. Fine, it's not.
I don't know.
Right, meaning the literal read of her story is 4 words is more problematic than 2.
Yeah.
Right? Okay, but let me show you an even more extreme one, I guess. So go back to number 3. So this is a Gemara that appears in several places in Shas. It's in the context of Onat Dvarim. Well, really, it starts in the context of Onat Mamon and then spills over to Onat Dvarim. So what's Onat Mamon? Deceitful overcharging. Right? People sometimes say it's overcharging. That's actually wrong. Onat Mamon is not overcharging, it's deceitful overcharging. Right? Not deceitful overcharging is not ona'ah. Right? It may be something else, but it's not ona'ah.
What if, like, everyone understands that if you buy this product from not like a wholesale marketplace, there's going to be a markup on it?
Right. Right. There's a Oraita problem of Onat Mamon, which is often conflated with a Derabanan problem called Hafkat Sharim. Hafkat Sharim is price gouging, right? And market and price manipulation. Onat Varim is overcharging, right? Deceitful overcharging. Those are not the same, right? Because price gouging is, I'm not overcharging you in the sense that I'm actually charging you the correct price. It's just that I drove the price up to a point where it shouldn't be. But right now, this is now the market price, right? Ona'ah depends on market price. It's not deceitfully overcharging for market price. Hafkat Sharim is a problem on manipulating the market. Okay, but the Gemara derives, and in addition to Onat Dvarim, we learn a additional prohibition from Ona'ah from Onat Mamon, called Onat Dvarim, which is
using your words.
Yeah, hurting people. It's hurting people with words. So, in that context, the Gemara says as follows: Amar Rabbi Yochanan Mishum Rishon ben Yochai, Gadol Onat Dvarim Onat Mamon. Hurting people with words is worse than deceitfully overcharging them. Why? First, the textual proof. Shezen Amar by Onat Dvarim, by not hurting people with your words, it says, V'yoreita me'elokecha, fear God. V'zelon Amar v'yoreita me'elokecha. And it doesn't say fear God by the context of monetary. Rabbi Elazar Omer, Ze begufo, v'ze b'mamonel. Elazar said, additionally, one hurts someone, hurts themselves, right? The other hurts their money. Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachmani Omer, Zenitan Lishavon, Zelonitan Lishavon. One, you can just return, right? You can, if you overcharge someone, you can just give the money back. But if you hurt someone with words, it's not so easy to take it back. So then the Gemara one-ups this and says, okay, that's just true of hurting people with words, bullying or whatever, whatever you want to call it. But if you embarrass them, it's even worse. Tani Tani Kameder of Nachman Bar Yitzchak. If you embarrass someone publicly, you cause the color to drain from their face, right? That's the literal meaning of malbin, right? Is to cause their face to become lavan, right? To cause their face to pale. So it's as if you murdered. And Amar Le Shapir Ka'amart said, you're right. The chazina le the azil sum kavadi chavara. You know that because the blood literally drains from their face. There's a physical component to embarrassing. Amar le Abaye le Rav Dimi b'marava b'mayze. Here, what are they really careful about in Eretz Yisrael? Amar le b'achvei ape. They're really careful not to embarrass people. The Amar Rav Chanina, because Rav Chanina says Akol Yardim leGehinnom chutz mishlosha. Because everyone goes to Gehenna except for three. Hakol sad gadaitach. You think everyone goes to purgatory? No. Elaim Akol Yardim leGehinnom olim chutz mishlosha Yardim ein olim. Everyone goes to Gehenna, but most people get out. But there are three groups of people that never get out. They stay there for eternity. Who are they? Velohain, Habal Ishinish, an adulterer. Hamal bin Pnei Chaveiro Barabim, someone who embarrasses someone publicly. V'mechanesh Imro leChaveiro, and someone who gives someone a bad nickname. Mechaneh Hainu Malbin, isn't giving a bad name embarrassing. Where it says, Avagav Dedash Bebishme, even if they've gotten used to it by this point.
Wait, what?
Brooke's going to hell, y'all.
Did you not know that? Well, I just disagree with their definition of nickname. It doesn't have to be exactly what they're saying.
I keep telling her I don't like it. She keeps saying it.
No,
I think
that
you're
is so
going to
not
hell.
true. You're fine with it.
That's
when
not
it's
true.
just-
She says she doesn't like it like every day.
No, only when I'm in the presence of other people.
Okay, I literally said it's acceptable in the presence of other people but then you did it anyways
No,
because you didn't care.
Oh my
no.
god.
It was an
Nonetheless,
Well,
yes, because
you can draw your own halachic conclusion, though I think the conclusion is
Enjoy it.
pretty
I'm
obvious.
not going to Gehenna.
Well, just because you say that doesn't make it true.
Well, it's going to be true.
Okay. Amar Rabba bar Yochanan Rabbi Yochanan, and then he adds, Noach lo sheyaval savek yeshidesh v'albin pnei chaver berabim. It's even better to enter into a case of doubtful adultery than to embarrass someone publicly. And then the Gemara proves this from David. Didarish Rabba, Maidech Lezot Samchuvin. Asafu Karbelo Damu, Amar David Levenegel Baruch, Rabban Shalom Golav Yadul Lefanecha Shein Emayu Makarim Bisari, Lo Yadami Shodi La'aretz. David says in very poetic language, you would know that if right? You would cut me at this point, I wouldn't bleed, right? I've been embarrassed so much, the blood is gone, right? I'm dead. Even when I'm dealing with complicated halachic issues, they say to me, David, they taunt me and say, David, what's the punishment for an adulterer? And I tell them, an adulterer, you're right, gets killed. But he'll have a portion in the world to come. But people who embarrass people publicly, they have no portion in the world to come. And then it concludes it. It's better to throw yourself into a fiery furnace and not embarrass someone publicly. Minolan, where do we know that from? Mitamar. Right, from Tamar. Because of the story of Tamar, someone remind me of the story of Tamar.
Helping with you, that she dressed up.
Yeah.
Very good. And then what's for Chazal, the critical moment is that at the moment she could save her life by saying, Yehuda, you're the father. What does she do instead?
Whoever is the father comes.
Right, whoever happens to own these, that's the father. Meaning she gives him an out rather than outing him herself, which ostensibly put her life in danger because he could have had her killed before the truth came out. Okay? A similar midrash, Amar of Shmuel Bar Nachman, L'sakana Gdol Yard Yosef, Shemargu Achav En Bria Ba'olam Makiro, V'lama Amar Otzio Kol Ish Me'alai, L'kach Amar Yosef V'libo Mutav Sherok V'lav Ayesh Achai Mipnei HaMitrim. The midrash says the same about Yosef. That Yosef waited to kick everybody out, all the Mitzrim out, to reveal himself to his brothers. The Gemara said, why isn't that dangerous? Right? For him to be alone with people that he's been accusing and threatening to enslave. Right? Why would he kick everybody else out of the room? Isn't that a bit dangerous? And the Midrash says, well, yeah, Yosef said, I'd rather die. I'd rather risk my life than embarrass my brothers, so I'll wait for them to be gone to reveal myself. Okay. So, in this Gemara, embarrassing people is equated with murder. The Gemara then has a prescriptive statement that it's better to throw yourself into a fiery furnace rather than embarrass someone publicly. So, very simple question. You read this Gemara. Is embarrassing someone publicly a cardinal sin?
It seems like yes.
Okay, we have one vote for yes. Good. Support. Why would you say yes?
Because it's better for you to die.
Very good, right? It says it's equivalent to murder. It says throw yourself into a fiery furnace rather than embarrass someone. That's called being a cardinal sin. Okay. Anyone want to vote for no? Yeah.
I'd say it's more of like a philosophical underpinning than like a cardinal sin because like.
Very good. Right? The alternative is to say no. It's
a philosophical like and moral argument.
Yeah, it's a philosophical moral hyperbole.
Like you can't.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Same thing with Lashon Hara then.
Yeah, same as Lashon Hara, very good. Exact same as Lashon Hara. Right, the Gemara by Lashon Hara, which says that Lashon Hara is equivalent to Gilarai Chadam and Avodah Zarah. Same type of thing.
How come you stay in Gehenna if you have like committed adultery or like embarrassed someone against one about anything?
Every time someone asks me about what happens in Gehenna, that's where I check out. I don't know.
I'm confused. If you murder someone, then it's fine. But like if
Hey, whoa. The Gemara never said murder was fine. That never came up in any Gemara. Right? The Gemara is indeed employing...
someone not on this list?
You're blatantly not listening to them and disregarding everything that has to do with their own being.
I tend to think that, yes, this is hyperbole. And in hyperbole, right, it's not as important to state the obvious. Right?
So there are three things that you wouldn't think there on this list.
Well, embarrassing people publicly happens all the time. Giving people nicknames happens all the time. Even adultery, right, which is generally understood to be bad, though I guess not so much in the 21st century, but probably not Chazal was a given, still, right, there's always counter-arguments like, right, well, it's a dead marriage, right, whatever, right, love trumps all, I don't know, right, who knows, right, in the Greeks, in the Greek philosophy, in the Greek tragedies, right? Love is enough to wage wars. You have things, you can have justifications. Okay, so I wanted to show you just how far the Rishonim take this Gemara in the two directions. So there are two major Rishonim who agree with Avigail and say, yeah, it is in fact Yehareg Vel Yavor. Tosfot and Rabbeinu Yonah. Tosfot says in Sota Daf Yud, V'nira Haid Lo Chashiv Le B'Hadei Shalosh Averot. Right? Why is this not mentioned as one of the big three? Right? That's a good question as to if this is a cardinal sin, why doesn't it get listed in the Gemara, which has three cardinal sins? So Tosfot says, She'inam Nevuach Nefesh, I would go Chavim Gilarad Shuchadamim. Right? Idolatry, sexual prohibitions, and murder. Yishum Naver Al Banat Panim in Mefuresh Betarov Al Noket Ela Verat Mefuresha. So Tosfot says something shocking, which is that when the Gemara says there are only three sins which are cardinal, it meant three sins that are explicit in the Torah. But Onat Dvarim is a derivative. It's not explicit in the Torah. We derive it from Onat Mamon. And therefore, it is Yehareg Vel Yavor. It is a cardinal sin, but it doesn't get counted in the three because it wasn't explicit.
I don't like his reasoning.
Oh, very good.
Yeah.
So this is textually fine, it works, but it's so logically problematic. Why is it logically problematic?
Because you can say, oh, anything, I'm just deriving that this is a cardinal.
Right, first of all, you could say about anything, and I would say even more.
I mean, because the Torah wasn't listing examples, it was listing exclusives.
Yeah! And I would say even more. If I had to guess which things are Yehareg Vel Yavor, right, are cardinal.
There are things that are written in
Yeah,
the
very
Torah.
good. If I had to guess, it would be things in the Torah. To say, oh, no. There's a lot of things that are like implied by the Torah that are also cardinal sins, but they weren't important enough to get any space in the Torah. They just happen to be cardinal sins. Right? That is a very weird construct. Right? That is a very weird construct. But that's Tosfos' understanding. Rabbeinu Yonah has a different conceptualization, and that is in number 6, Vine Avak Ratzicha Halbanat Panim. Very simple. The Ran writes that the three big sins aren't sins, they're categories of sin, and therefore there are subsections called Abu Zrayu, right, derivatives. And he says, public humiliation is a derivative of murder. And therefore it is counted. It's not an independent sin, it's a derivative. Because it's sort of like murder, right? Murder, you shoot someone, their blood gushes out onto the floor. When you embarrass someone, their blood drains from their face. Similar. So that's his conceptualization. So here we have two major Rishonim who, in both very creative reads, take this Gemara and say, yes indeed. Embarrassing people publicly is Yehareg Vel Yavor. Now, look at the Rivash, number 7. This is a Tshuva Sheishet, and he writes as follows: Lo Amru Bo Yehareg Vel Yavor Kmo Botan Shalosh Averot. We do not say it's Yehareg Vel Yavor like murder, sexual prohibitions, and idolatry. Now, if you just said that, if I stopped there, I'd say, okay, fine. Tosfot and Rabbeinu Yonah say it's literal, and they come up with clever ways of reading it. And he says it's not literal. That would be one thing. It's his next line that highlights just how flexible text can be. Vizeh lo ala al da'at shum adam. The fact that these should be a cardinal sin, what does Zeh lo Allah al da'at shum adam mean?
Well, you have to be an idiot to think
It's more than that. No one ever thought this. Right? Not as, you shouldn't ever think this, as no one has ever thought this. Ever.
Wow.
V'lo chashav enosh. No human being has ever believed this. Ever. Ever, ever, ever. Ella, shederech hachachamim lahaflig v'hagdalat avonot. It's just that the way of sages is to express sins hyperbolically. Kidei sheyishmor adam mikashel behen. So that people won't sin in them. Like, as Abigail said before, we do by Lashon Hara. Right, that's his example. So here, what do you have? You have two major Rishonim. Look at the Gemara, and they say, hey, the Gemara seems like it's saying that embarrassing people publicly is a cardinal sin. That's weird. It goes against the Gemara that says it's only murder, sexual prohibitions, and avodah zarah. Big deal, right? I will take the Gemara literally. I'll either come up with the novel idea that murder, that embarrassing people is a subset of murder, or the even more wild idea of Tosot, that there are three cardinal sins that are explicit in the Torah, but then there could be a bunch of implications that are also cardinal sins. They just weren't important enough to make it into the Torah explicitly, but they are cardinal sins, right? Which is a wild, wild read. And then at the other extreme, you have the Rivash, who not only does he say, I disagree, he says, it never happened. It's never happened. No one ever thought that. No one will ever think that. That's patently absurd. And here's the question I would pose to you. Can you prove that either one is right?
I don't know how we can even make the assertion that, like, no one ever thought this.
It's a rhetorical device.
I know, but
Yes,
like,
it's a rhetorical advice, talking about rhetorical advice. But I want to ask the question very pointedly. Looking at this text, can you prove conclusively, dispositively, that who's right? No, because it's not a question of how to interpret a text. It's literally it's a question of everyone agrees what the line says. The question is it literal or hyperbole? And then the nafkamina to that question is it literally a cardinal sin for which you have to forfeit your life? Or is this just hyperbole and there's no halachic implication whatsoever? That is about as extreme as you could get, right? From saying, this is a prohibition which is not explicit in the Torah, but we want to talk about it hyperbolically, so we say it's really, really bad, to saying, this is up there with murder, and if someone held a gun to your head and said, I will shoot you if you don't post something insulting on Facebook about that person, you actually should take the bullet to the head, right? That is Tosfot, right? That being the range of how to interpret this text just highlights how malleable a text can be. And I would point out that, now, if you look at it in number 8, the Meiri just says that it's derech tzachut. It's an expression, right? But lest you think that this dispute stayed in the time of the Rishonim, I'll tell you, even in the 20th century, this was a machloket. And a posek, one of the most important poskim of the second half of the 20th century, if not the most important Israeli posek of the second half of the 20th century, Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, in Tshuvat Mincha Shlomo Chelik Aleph Tshuva Zayin, in fact, paskins like Tosha, and says, yep, embarrassing people publicly is Yahari Val Yavor. That's it. We paskin like Tosha. And what's his reason? Because he says, look, it's Tosha ben Yonah against the Meiri, essentially. So, Tosha ben Yonah, Meiri, Tosha. That's it. And then he expands it. Right? You want to understand what's at stake here. He says, not only that, but wait a second, if it's Yahari Val Yavor, so should we entertain the possibility that if someone is running after someone to embarrass them, so they're a rodef and you should kill them? Can you be Machal Shabbos to prevent someone from embarrassing someone publicly? Right? All these are open questions for him. Because if Tosfot is right, so then it's equivalent to murder. If it's equivalent to murder, so then maybe it's like rodef. Maybe you can be Machal Shabbos. Right? That's what Shlomo Zalman Auerbach. It's not like, right? The other extreme, Rav Henkin writes a very long tshuva in Bnei Banim, and he says, are you out of your mind? Right? Are you absolutely crazy? And he says, what are you telling me it's Tosfot and Rabbeinu Yonah against the Meiri? And he just lines up like 50 other Rishonim who agree with Meiri, and he says, I mean, it's a weird Tosfot, but you can't seriously tell me that this is halacha. Now, there are other possibilities, right? I'll throw them out outside. It's possible. There is a general machloket between the Rambam and Tosfot. The Rambam believes that the 3 major sins are the only sins for which you're allowed to give up your life. The other 610 mitzvot, even if you wanted to, you couldn't give up your life rather than violate them. You're obligated to save your life. Tosfot thinks that there are 3 mitzvot in the Torah for which you are obligated, and 610 for which you have the right to give up your life if you so choose, but you're not obligated. So it is possible that, right, there are several reads that you can offer in the Achronim, such as maybe on embarrassing people publicly, the Rambam would agree to Tosfot, meaning it's not saying you have to, it's just saying you have the right to. Or, alternatively, if you paskin like Tosfot in general, that you're always allowed to give up your life if you want to. So the Gemara isn't saying you have to, it's just saying no achlo, that you always have the right to give up your life rather than violate the Torah. But when it comes to embarrassing people publicly, you don't have to, but this isn't neutral, right? It's we would encourage you to do that. I once heard Rai Clapper suggest, as a theoretical possibility, that maybe the Gemara is saying it hyperbolically to get across that in certain circumstances, where it's not just like a one-time humiliation, but where you know that by doing something you will ruin somebody's life forever, like irreparably ruin their life, that the Gemara is giving you the option to not do that by sacrificing yourself, which, if you want an example of what that looks like, there was an excellent article in First Things 2-3 years ago or so by Helen Andrews called Shame Storm, about how many decades it took for her to escape a video posted by her ex-boyfriend of accusing her of being like a narcissist or something like that, and how much it dogged her and prevented her from getting jobs and followed her even when she moved from America to Australia, and even after she got married and changed her name to her husband's name, it still managed to follow her and affect her life for decades. So, you know, it could be that the Gemara is saying, look, you're not obligated to, but understand that there are certain very extreme scenarios where maybe you might actually want to entertain the possibility of giving up your life rather than destroying someone else's for the long term. That's, I guess, another theoretical possibility. But again, this is, right, just an example of the type of flexibility that you have in text. Okay, let me give you at least one more example. So look at number 2. Okay? The Taz here summarizes a major machloket between himself and the Tur in basically Kol HaTorah Kula. And that is the following. Many times in Shas, you'll have the Gemara make a comparison. X to Y. Right? X is like Y. So, as Rav Lechansin used to put it, every time you see a magic chaf, right, you see the chaf of comparison. What do you have to ask? What's the first thing you have to ask? So as he put it, chaf can mean one of 2 very different things. In Hebrew, he put it as chaf hadimyon and chaf hashivyon. The chaf of equivalence or the chaf of comparison. Meaning, is X to Y, meaning X equals Y? Or X to Y is X is like Y in a certain way? The Tur and the Taz argue about this in every single place that this appears in Kol HaTorah Kula. And that, trust me, has a lot of nafkaminas. So, look, he writes, Hatur siyem she'aviv mevio l'chai olam haba, Rabba mevio l'chai olam haba, l'olam hazeh, Rabba mevio l'chai olam haba. The Tur finishes Hilchot Kibbud Av V'Eim by saying, your parents bring you to this world, your teachers to the world to come. Ve'ein l'cha kavod kavod Rabba, umora k'mora'o. There is no honor as great as honor of your teacher, or awe as much as the awe of your teacher. V'amru chachamim umora rabcha k'mora shamayim. And the sages say that the fear of your teacher should be like the fear of heaven. V'hikshe b'prisha. The Prisha said, Imkain mayoter me'aviv. Agam ba'aviv katav Rabbeinu. Dechvod amaro kachvod umora Hashem. Then in what sense is the fear and honor of your teachers more than your parents if both of them are equated to the fear of God? V'tiritz the kol hamukesh she'en shava legamrei ela makesh ma she'en kein mora rabcha k'mor shamayim d'ashu min Hashem elokech atiro l'rabot rabo. So he says very simple. Chaf usually means it's like in a certain sense, but it's not equivalent, and therefore, right? You can't say, oh, x equals, right? X equals y, and x equals, and y equals z. So, right? X equals z. Right? It doesn't really work that way. These are comparisons. We're saying, it's an expression. It's sort of like it, but you can't draw firm halachic conclusions because these are similarities, not equivalences. And the Taz writes, "V'lo nihira," it's not true. Wrong. Anything that's equated is, anything with a chaf is equivalent, not similar. Now that's a major machloket, and it's not just one little machloket. It's literally a machloket about one letter that changes potentially, tens of halachot. Do you think that chaf is similar or equivalent to? And I don't know if we have time to read it inside, but if I gave it to you in the summary in 19 minutes, here's a nafkamina to that question. The Gemara says that kol hamagadel yatom b'doch beido kilu yelado. If you raise an orphan in your house, it's as if you gave birth to them. Okay, so do you fulfill the mitzvah peruvu of procreation by adopting? Most poskim will tell you it's a beautiful mitzvah, but it's not procreation. It's not a substitute. You can't choose, unless you have very good reason, right, to give up on the mitzvah of having children because you want to adopt. And yet, Rosh Shlomo Kluger, in his first simon in Shulchan Aruch, says, no. It says, Kol hamagadel yatom b'toch beido ki'ilu yelado. And therefore, he says, you do. Now, he has a little bit of a weird formulation. He has this novel interpretation that in order to fulfill the mitzvah of procreation, it's not enough to have children. You need to also be engaged in the procreative act. And therefore, he thinks that, but in a weird way, right? He doesn't actually think that you need to procreate naturally, right? Because that would mean you have to, right, actually have sex and have a child from that act. He just thinks you need to have children and to at some point engaged in the procreative act. And therefore, he says you fulfill the mitzvah peruvu if at some point a couple is together and they adopt children, so they did the act and they have the result, even though the act and the result are unrelated. Which is a very weird conceptualization of the whole mitzvah, but that's not really the point of this. The point is simply that here, when the Tzitz Eliezer says, whether Rav Shlomo Kluger is right or not hangs on what question? The machloket between the Prisha and the Taz. That if you hold that whenever the Torah compares X to Y, it means it literally, so then adoption is compared to having children, so by adopting you fulfill the mitzvah peruvu. And if you think that chaf is kaf dimyon and not shivyon, it's similar to but not necessarily equivalent, so then you don't. The entire machloket comes down to a meta machloket about how to understand one letter. And again, can you prove who's right? No, because this isn't a local machloket. It's not a localized question, how do I read this Gemara? It's a meta machloket about how you read all comparisons in the Torah, in Chazal. Every time the Chazal compares something with the letter Chaf, do I have to assume equivalence, or can I assume similarity? And again, all these are just examples, and they're sort of scattered around shots. But the point of bringing them is, as I said, what I want to show you as we sort of start actually researching after Sukkot, when we have uninterrupted months of learning, which we don't have now, hopefully uninterrupted, I don't know. But Sukkot is Sukkot, and no one remembers anything after Sukkot. So it was like when I gave Shir at Migdal, when I knew Yom Kippur was coming up, I'm like, I have to finish today, because I don't want to have to repeat literally everything we did, right, after 5 days of break. It's not worth it. And definitely a once-a-week shir after a week of sukkahs. We should start when we have a chunk. But what I wanted to do before we actually jump into the text is to just recognize that the reason I expect that we're going to look at the same texts together, learn the same topic together, but there's no reason to assume not only that you won't have the identical opinion by the end of this, but that you might end up having diametrically opposed positions, is to realize that's just inherent. Right? Texts are ambiguous. And if that's true of a single text, when you have a topic which is complicated, with many different facets, obviously, you could look at the exact same material, you could study the material together, but in the end of the day, what decision you make comes up to there is no there's no definitely right or definitely wrong. Texts are flexible. And you need to be braced for that when you learn a sugya, especially when you're learning it with an eye towards coming up with your own decision. Because in the end of the day, if you think that you can use a text as a crutch, right, you can say, well, in the end of the day, I'll be able to bolster everything with text. Yeah, you can. But bolstering something with text is not the same as proving it. Right? You can support it. You can say, I think this is the most plausible read. That's why I'm convinced by this read. But if you think you're going to be able to bludgeon someone into agreeing with you because you have a text, these sort of extreme examples should prove to you that's not happening. Right? Texts are, by definition, subject to flexibility, to meta-assumptions about how you read, right? And then you have to interpret. And then you have to look at the history of interpretation and the authorities. And then you have to take into account minhag. And then you have to right? You have to take all those into account. That makes psak really, really hard, really, really messy, and is why you should expect as a given multi-vocality and a variety of opinions. Okay? So, as we go into these experiments starting after because I want you to be braced for that. I want you to think about that. And then we'll start actually tackling the topic when we come back. Okay? So with that...